Good morning, America. How are ya? Monday morning rail will be 500 miles before the day is done. I'm Denny Yelsma, and I'm at the world-famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum. And today is Monday, and we all know what we do on Monday. It's show and tell, and it starts right now. Show and tell this morning is really exciting, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Gulf Wind Section 2, and that's what today's show is the second section of the Gulf Wind. Last week we talked about the Gulf Wind and explained it went from Jacksonville to New Orleans, and I want to get in a little bit more detail about the Gulf Wind. And also we have two people that are members of our club that actually sat and rode in these cars, and we're going to interview them, and they're going to tell us a little bit about their experience, which I think is really, really neat. But first of all, from last week's show, you remember, this here is the Royal Canal, and there were two of these cars. These were the stainless steel cars that were originally bought by the LN to run on the Crescent. And in 1957, the Crescent wanted to cut back on a lot of expense, and so they took these cars, and L&N then assigned them to the Gulf Wind. There was the Royal Street and the Royal Canal. And so this car had about 7-8 cars. The next car we had was a lightweight Pine Series sleeper. And this was a 6-6 bedroom configuration L&N car. And the next car we have is the Seaboard Diner. Now, this train left Jacksonville at 5 o'clock. They served a meal, and it was the Seaboard always had great meals. And you talk to the people that rode on the train, and they really talked about the service they got on the train, and all of Seaboard's train, and it was just a great meal. When the train got into Tallahassee, which was late at night, they took the diner off, and it went to Chattahoochee. We have a Seaboard, what we call the American Flyer cars, and the Osgood Bradley cars, and then we have a heavyweight coach, and then we have another diner that was added at Mobile in the middle of the night. It spent about a half hour there, and you got an L&N diner, and then that served breakfast when it got into from Mobile all the way into New Orleans. It got into New Orleans around 8:45. And then we had our head-in equipment, which we have a baggage RPO, and then we had a E8 that powered this train on the Seaboard side. And the reason Seaboard used the E8s because they had a different gear ratio, and their speed would vary. Now, this train was on Seaboard tracks until they got to Chattahoochee, Florida. Chattahoochee is when the L&N picked it up, and the L&N typically had E7s. And so this was really kind of a night train, and that's why you don't see a lot of pictures of the Gulf Wind. But this was their drum head. It was green. I don't have a colored picture, but this was the drum head. And the most famous part of this train was the observation stainless steel. It had high windows. There were 6 cars like this made. L&N had 2 of them, and it was a gorgeous car, and it had high windows. So it was a very popular car. Now, the observation car was very unique on this train. And once again, they had the Royal Canal and the Royal Street. And we have one of our members, and actually he's the president of the Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum, Rodney Butcher, spent 44 years as an engineer for the Florida East Coast, and a great historian. When he was about 5 years old, his grandfather was taking a trip to New Orleans, and he took Rodney and his dad, and he's going to tell us about that experience, and he'll tell us right now. Okay, Rodney, this is Rodney Butcher. He's the president of the world famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum, and he's going to tell us his experience of being on the Royal Canal.
Hello, I owe a lot of my interest in the railroad industry to my grandparents. They traveled by rail and steamship in the 50s and 60s, and I was fortunate enough to always take them down to the rail or ships to take them abroad. And one of my favorite memories was the Gulf Wind. It was either 59 or 60 where they caught a steamship out of New Orleans, but in order to get to New Orleans they rode the Gulf Wind. So we took them down to the Jacksonville terminal. We boarded the train as it was spotted at the button block. And since the train originated here, it gave us plenty of time to visit. So we boarded the train, got them in the bedroom, and spent the afternoon visiting with them in the lounge portion of the observation car, which gave us a great advantage because we were at the button block and we could see all the goings on at the terminal like we were on an elevated platform. So it was really a fun, great experience, and certainly times were different then. I just wish that this type of travel was still available. So that's my experience on this particular train. I hope you all enjoy it.
Thank you, Rodney. Well, that was very interesting, Rodney, and I know the viewers will really enjoy that. We also have a member of the club, and it's Phil Smith. His father was the head freight agent for the Florida East Coast Railroad, and he rode this train, the Gulf Wind, from Jacksonville to New Orleans, and he's going to tell us about his experience of riding in the Royal Canal, the sleeping car, his dining car experience. And so, Phil, why don't you come on in?
Sure.
And this is Phil Smith. He is our Secretary Treasurer of the world famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum. And tell us about this exciting ride on the Gulf Wind.
Well, I was a very young man, so it was trains were very exciting to me at the time, even if my father hadn't worked for the railroad. My mother and I were invited to go on a business trip with him to New Orleans, and that's how we had the opportunity to get on the Florida East Coast and the Gulf Wind to go to New Orleans. Now,
and this was about 1961 or 62?
Probably 61 or 62.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if we rode by pass or not, but as you can see, my dad had a lot of passes. The railroads at the time used to give out passes. We've got Atlantic Coastline, Central Georgia, Chicago and Eastern Illinois, Gulf Mobile and Ohio, Missouri Pacific, Norfolk and Western, Wabash, and the old Frisco. So I remember getting on the train in St. Augustine and not having a lot of time to make the transition from the FEC over to the seaboard. And it made me think for a minute, in today's modern airline travel, we have bags with wheels and retractable handles. And I think about back in the day, the people handling the bags, this is my mom's actual bag, American Tourister. You can see there's no wheels and just a handle. So think about the people handling the bags in those days, taking these from one train to another. And oh, by the way, as you know, you didn't weigh them in like you do today before you get on the plane to make sure they're not more than 50 pounds. Whatever it was went. So baggage and the fact that the railroad didn't lose a lot of baggage, I think was pretty outstanding for that time period. So we made the switch in Jacksonville over to the Gulf Wind, had a nice dinner in the Seaboard dining car, as Denny pointed out.
Do you remember what you ate?
I do not remember what I ate. I'm sure it was ordered for me. So, and after that, what I do remember was my dad took me by the hand and we walked back into the observation car. He wanted me to be able to look out the back windows of the round observation car, see the track going by. And, I remember people in there just relaxing and having a good time, a very relaxing way to travel. We walked back to that end of the observation car. Then we went back up to our sleeping car, which I assume must have been a L&N car. And we had our own bathroom and double bunks. Of course, I got the top bunk. And I guess the bottom bunk must have been wide enough for two people to sleep in, because that's where my mom and dad slept. So I was in the top bunk, they were in the bottom bunk. Woke up in the morning, and what I vividly remember about the whole trip was going down to the dining car and having a bowl of Frosted Flakes as we were crossing Lake Pontchartrain. So, that would have been in this L&N diner, because, as Denny pointed out, the Gulf Wind, the Seaboard diner came off in Tallahassee, and the L&N diner came on in either Mobile or Mobile. So after that diner was on, we went up and had breakfast, had some Frosted Flakes as we were crossing Lake Pontchartrain, and then off to New Orleans we went. And the last thing I remember is we stayed at the Hotel Monteleone, which is still around today. It has the carousel bar, which is still in operation. So some relics of history are still around to partake in. But it was a very enjoyable trip and a lot of fun.
All right. Well, Phil and Rodney, we thank you very much for sharing those experiences. And when we were small children, to remember riding the train was a great experience, and especially on this train that we're highlighting, the Seaboard L&N, the Gulf Wind. And that's the way it is at the world-famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad in beautiful Jacksonville, Florida.